She was invisible. That was the word for it, though nobody would have used it out loud because the people who made her invisible were the same people who would have considered the observation beneath them. Every evening before the city had finished its dinner she was already inside the buildings it worked in, moving through the corridors with her equipment, restoring everything to the condition that the people who occupied those spaces expected to find it in the following morning without ever once considering how it arrived that way. She cleaned what they used and removed what they discarded and polished what they walked on, and nobody turned around to look. Nobody stopped to ask who was behind the cart in the corridor. Nobody, until one evening a man who owned the building looked up from behind his desk and heard something that made him stop everything he was thinking, and what happened next was so far outside the boundaries of anything her life had prepared her for that she should have said no before he finished the sentence. She did not say no. And what followed was a story that nobody in that building, including the two of them, could have written in advance. Stay with me. Welcome to Bishop Tales, where every week we bring you powerful, emotional, and unforgettable stories that stay with you long after the video ends. If you are new here, please subscribe right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from tonight. Are you in Nigeria, Ghana, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, South Africa, Jamaica, or somewhere else in this world? We love knowing where our family is. Now let us begin. Her name was Amara. She was 23 years old and she had a quality about her that people who took the time to look past the uniform might have called grace, not the performed kind but the kind that comes from having been required by circumstance to move carefully through the world without making more noise than necessary. She had learned this at 17 when her parents died 14 months apart from each other, and the world had not waited for her grief to conclude before presenting her with a set of practical problems that required her immediate and sustained attention. Her mother had gone first, a complication from an illness that the hospital had been monitoring and had misjudged. Her father had followed the following year in a way that the people who knew him said was not really a surprise because he had never had any intention of living very long without her mother and had simply made good on that quiet intention. What they left behind was Amara and two younger siblings. Her brother Emeka was 14, serious and slightly stubborn in the way of boys who are trying to be men before they have the information for it. Her sister Ngozi was 10 and had the specific gift of finding something worth laughing about in almost any situation, which Amara considered the most valuable quality any of them possessed given their circumstances. They lived in a two-room apartment in a part of the city that did not appear in the publications that covered the city's cultural life unless there was a crime statistic to be reported. The apartment was small and perpetually slightly cold in the winter, and the landlord was a man who treated the monthly rent conversation as a performance of power that Amara had learned to navigate with the patience of someone who understands that you sometimes have to absorb something in order to preserve something more important. She worked 3 jobs at the peak of it. A morning shift at a small restaurant where she cleaned and did prep work before the cooking staff arrived. An afternoon position helping an elderly woman in the neighborhood with her errands and medications. And the evening job at Obesai Holdings, the company whose building occupied a full block in the commercial district and whose cleaning contract had been awarded to the service she had applied to join because their pay rate was the best she had found, and she had done the mathematics carefully and the mathematics said she needed that pay rate. Even 3 jobs stretched thin. Emeka's school had begun sending letters about fees with the particular frequency of letters that have already been sent twice without result and are now becoming something else. The roof of the apartment had a conversation with the rain every time there was significant weather, and the conversation was not one that favored Amara's side. The landlord had started knocking differently. She understood the difference. She was working on a solution with the specific urgency of someone for whom working on a solution is not an intellectual exercise but the primary activity of most of their waking hours. The Obesai Holdings building was 40 floors of glass and imported marble, and the kind of quiet that premium construction produces in the late evening when the business of the day has vacated it. Amara had worked in it for 6 weeks when the evening in question arrived. She had learned the building's patterns and preferences, which floors required the most careful attention, which offices accumulated the heaviest paper waste, which executive bathrooms needed servicing before the others, and why. She was thorough in the specific way of people for whom the work is not just income but also a matter of self-respect that exists independently of whether anyone is watching. She had encountered the CEO twice in those 6 weeks, both times briefly and neither time memorably. The first time she had wheeled her cart past a glass-walled conference room where he was presenting to a group of people whose body language suggested the presentation had been running long enough that attention was becoming an act of discipline rather than interest. He had not noticed her. The second time she had been cleaning the corridor near his private office floor and had accidentally caught the door frame with her equipment in a way that produced a sound she immediately wished she could take back. He had looked up, assessed the situation with the economical expression of someone who assesses things quickly and moves on, and returned to what he was doing. She had apologized and continued. To him she was a sound in a corridor. To her he was a reminder about which floor to navigate with extra caution. His name was Chukwemeka Obasai, who went by Ike in the professional world and who had been running Obasai Holdings since he was 31 when his father had moved to a senior advisory role and handed him operational control of the company his grandfather had founded. He was 38 now, precise and exacting in the way of someone who has inherited both the responsibility and the discipline that the responsibility requires, and who has worked since his early 20s with the awareness that the thing he was eventually going to be entrusted with was significant enough to deserve that discipline. His employees respected him in the careful way that people respect weather, not warmly but attentively, understanding that paying attention to it is the sensible practice. His personal life was the subject of more conversation than he had ever invited or enjoyed. He had tried several times in the past 5 years to build something that worked. Each time the relationship had navigated, with the specific inevitability of water finding the lowest available path, toward the same conclusion. The moment the full financial dimension of his life became apparent to the woman he was with, something in the dynamic shifted. The questions became more specific. The interest became more particular in its focus. The warmth increased as the visibility of what was available increased, and Ike had the particular intelligence of someone who notices patterns and the particular sadness of someone who notices them in a place where he had hoped not to find them. He had stopped being surprised. He had started, instead, being tired of it. The situation was further complicated by his father. Bartholomew Obasai was 72 and had built 2 companies before founding the one that bore their family name, and he had done it with the combination of instinct and endurance that produces things that last. His health had been unsteady across the past year and the doctors had been measured in their communication about the trajectory. He had made a decision with the completeness of a man who has never done anything partially. He was ready to transfer the full weight of his interests to his son. The company, the holdings, everything. But there was a condition. Bartholomew had expressed it with the economy of a man who believes that the most important things can be said in a few words. He said a man who has not built a real life alongside his professional one does not understand what he is building or why. He said, bring me evidence that you understand both and the company is yours without reservation. Ike had argued. Bartholomew had not moved. The conversation had ended with Ike alone in his office in the particular quality of silence that follows an ultimatum that a person cannot dismiss and does not know how to meet. He had been sitting in that silence, speaking to himself about the specific pattern of interest that money generates in people who encounter it, when he heard something in the corridor outside his office door. A sound. Very small. Quickly covered. The sound of someone who had heard something they were not supposed to hear and was trying to disappear into the fact of not having heard it. He opened the door. The young woman standing in the corridor with her hand pressed to her mouth and her eyes very wide was not a sound. She was a person. She said immediately that she was only cleaning and she was extremely sorry. He looked at her for a moment. He had seen her before. The cleaner from the evening shift. He looked at her, then turned back into his office and closed the door most of the way and stood in the middle of the room and thought about something unusual. The thought was unconventional. He turned it over several times and examined it from its different angles. It had a practical logic that he found, the more he examined it, genuinely difficult to dismiss. He was a man who had built a company through the willingness to act on well-considered unconventional ideas. He picked up his phone and called his executive assistant and said he needed a meeting arranged first thing in the morning with the member of the evening cleaning staff assigned to his floor. His assistant did not ask why. His assistant had learned over 3 years that why would be explained in the meeting. The next morning Amara was crossing the lobby on her way out when the front desk informed her that an envelope had been left for her in the supervisor's office. She found it. She opened it. She read it twice. She stood with her back against the wall for a moment and thought about the laugh, the small involuntary laugh she had been unable to suppress the night before, and she thought about the possible explanations for why the CEO of the building wanted to see her in his office at 8 in the morning. The explanations that came to mind were not uniformly good. She went anyway. She was not a person who avoided things simply because they were uncomfortable. The private elevator to the executive floor was a different category of experience from the service elevator she normally used. The offices on the upper floors had a quality of morning light that the lower floors did not share, coming through the glass walls in a way that made the city spread below look deliberate rather than accidental. She knocked on the large door at the end of the corridor. The voice inside said come in with the tone of someone who does not need to make his voice loud because the room obeys it already. The office was the kind of room that is designed to remind you of the difference between the person behind the desk and the person standing in front of it. Eek was already standing when she entered, which was not what she expected, and the standing somewhat disrupted the architecture of the room's intention. He said she was not in trouble. She felt a fraction of her tension release. Then he said she had overheard his conversation the previous evening. She said she was sorry. He said he understood it was not intentional, and that not being intentional was precisely why she was standing in his office rather than being asked to leave the building. He walked to the window and looked at the city before he spoke, which was the action of a man organizing what he is about to say into the most honest available version of it. He told her about his father's condition and about the condition his father had attached to the transfer of the company. He told her about the pattern he had identified across 5 years of relationships and what the pattern had produced in him. He told her that what he needed was someone who was not from his world, someone whose understanding of the value of things had been formed by a different relationship with scarcity and effort than the people he normally encountered, someone for whom the arrangement would be clear and transactional rather than an opportunity to navigate towards something else. He slid a document across the desk. Amara looked at the document. She looked at the title. She read the first page. She looked back up at him. He said it was a temporary arrangement. A fixed period. She would stay at the family house, be present at the occasions that mattered to his father, and at the conclusion of the period the arrangement would end cleanly and she would return to her life. He named the amount she would be paid. She heard it with the specific stillness of someone who has been calculating for so long that when a number arrives that changes the calculation, the body stops before the mind has finished processing what it means. It was enough to clear the rent arrears. It was enough to cover Emika's school fees through the year. It was enough to fix the roof and to stop the particular quality of the landlord's knocking. She looked at the contract. She said it was an unusual thing to be asked. He said he was aware of that. She said she was a cleaner. He said he was aware of that also. She said she wanted to go through the terms clearly before she agreed to anything. He said that was entirely reasonable. They spent 20 minutes on the document. She asked precise questions. He gave precise answers. She was not performing caution. She was actually being careful because she was a person who had learned that being careful about what you agree to was a form of respect for yourself. When they reached the signature line she sat for a moment. Then she said clearly so they both understood it, when the period ends it ends on the terms in this document and nothing else. He said yes. She signed. Now friends, I want to stop here for just a moment because if you are watching this and something in you is asking whether she made the right choice, you are exactly where Bishop Tales wants you to be. Please like this video right now and drop a comment below. Tell us, have you ever made a decision that looked impossible from the outside but felt like the only available thing from where you were standing? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do it right now because this story has so much further to go and you need to be here for all of it. The car that collected her the following morning was quieter than any vehicle she had ridden in and significantly longer. She spent the journey with her hands folded in her lap and watched the city move from familiar to unfamiliar through the window, the dense commercial blocks giving way to quieter roads and then to the kind of neighborhood where the space between properties is itself an expression of wealth, where the gates are serious and the trees are old and everything suggests that the people who live here have never had to hurry. The Obasai family estate appeared around a long gentle curve in the road as something that had been built with the intention of lasting several generations and had succeeded at the intention. Stone and old wood and the particular gravitas of a house that has held a family significant moments for a very long time. Eek told her as they turned into the drive not to be overwhelmed by it. She said she was not overwhelmed. He looked at her sideways in a way that suggested he had expected a different reaction. She said it was beautiful, simply, honestly, without hunger or performance, just the truthful response of someone looking at something beautiful and saying so. He looked at her for a moment longer than the comment required. The front door opened before the car had stopped fully. His father stood in the entrance with a cane for support, a man who had clearly once been physically imposing and who had not entirely surrendered that impression to time. Behind him were two younger men she recognized from context as Eek's brothers, Deo and Son, and several members of household staff arranged with the particular instinctive formation of people who understand that something significant is about to be introduced to the household. Every face wore a version of curiosity with varying degrees of effort to conceal it. Eek introduced her. "This is Amara." His father looked at her with the evaluative attention of someone who has been reading people for 7 decades and has not lost the skill. Amara met his gaze and greeted him with a respectful bow of her head and said "Good afternoon, Baba," in a voice that was soft but contained no uncertainty in it. He raised one eyebrow. He said she had good presence. Before Eek could add context, Amara said with a slight smile that she thought his son had made up his mind and she had gone along with it. The courtyard was quiet for a fraction of a second. Then Bartholomew laughed. A full and entirely unguarded laugh that reshaped his face into something younger than it had been a moment before. He said "Come inside" and waved everyone toward the entrance. The house was everything its exterior suggested. The proportions were right. The art was serious. The furniture had the weight of things chosen for permanence. But the atmosphere was the atmosphere of a house that has been very well maintained and not very well lived in. There was a formality that felt less like elegance and more like distance that has solidified over years into a structure that nobody has found the occasion or the energy to dismantle. Rooms used in isolation. Meals timed to avoid overlap. Staff who moved with the expert silence of people who understand that the best service in this household is the invisible kind. Amara had grown up in 2 rooms with 2 siblings and understood viscerally what it meant for a space to be actually inhabited. She knew the difference between a house that contained people and a house that people lived in. This was the first kind. She did not make a project of it. She simply started being herself. The first evening she found her way to the kitchen where the household cook, an older man named Uncle Pius who had cooked for the family for 14 years, was preparing the evening meal alone with the efficient quietness of someone who has long since made peace with working without company. Amara tied her hair back and said could she help, and Uncle Pius looked at her with the expression of someone pleasantly surprised by something unexpected. She rolled up her sleeves and they stood at the counter together, and from within the work a conversation found its way out, and then something that might eventually become laughter, and by the time the food was ready the kitchen felt like a room with people in it rather than a room with a task being performed. When the food was ready she found Eek and said quietly that it would be good if everyone ate at the same table. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the mild directness of someone making a suggestion rather than requesting permission. He said his family had their own schedules. She said she understood that. She said the food would be better in company. He said that was not typically how things were done. She said she imagined not. He held her gaze for a moment and then went and told his brothers dinner was ready at the main table. They assembled with the particular stiffness of people who have not shared a meal in long enough that the muscle memory of it has become unreliable. But Amara asked Deo about his work before the first dish had been served and he answered, and the answer led somewhere, and Son disagreed with something Deo said and said so with some energy, and Bartholomew said something dry from the end of the table that made Son put down his fork and look at his father with the expression of a man who has just been fairly caught by someone who knows him better than he had accounted for. Something in the room shifted. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But something that had been held very still began to move, the way a window opens and the air changes without anyone having moved the furniture. Eek watched from across the table. He did not have a category for what he was watching. He knew only that the house felt different than it had an hour ago, and that the difference had arrived with the woman sitting across from him who was asking his youngest brother about his ambitions with the genuine curiosity of someone who actually wanted to know. The days that followed had the same quality of gradual shift. Amara woke early and helped Uncle Pius with breakfast. She found Bartholomew in the morning room during his medication routine and made the routine into a conversation, asking him about the founding of the company and the decisions he was proudest of and the moments he had most doubted himself, and Bartholomew talked in the way of someone whose stories have been waiting for an audience that wanted them for their own sake rather than for the status of having been told them. His doctor, who visited 3 times that week, said at the end of the 3rd visit that the recovery was tracking ahead of the previous projection. Uncle Pius told Amara directly that the old man was getting better because someone had started paying attention to him. Eek noticed all of this. He told himself he was monitoring the arrangement's effectiveness. He told himself this with diminishing conviction as the days accumulated. The trouble arrived on the fourth morning. It came with the sound of a car braking too assertively on the stone drive and then a raised voice at the gate that had the specific quality of a performance that had been prepared and was now commencing. Eek was in the garden and heard it before he saw it. By the time he reached the front of the household had already gathered in the way that households gather when something is arriving that the house is not sure how to receive. A woman stood inside the gate in a dress designed for maximum impression, her face assembled into an expression that occupied the territory between grief and confrontation with the practiced precision of someone who has rehearsed both. Her name was Vanessa. She had been with Eek for approximately 4 months 2 years ago, an involvement he had ended with the clear and specific finality he brought to decisions that needed to be made, having identified, through the accumulating evidence of 4 months, that her interest in him was primarily navigational, mapping the financial geography of his life with the systematic attention of someone planning a route rather than enjoying the territory. She had not accepted this assessment. She had, apparently, arrived today to present a counter-argument. She crossed the courtyard with the stride of someone who has decided on the outcome of a scene before entering it. She pulled a document from her bag and directed it at Eek's chest. She said she was carrying his child. She said he had made commitments. She said she had come because she would not allow herself to be simply abandoned. Her voice carried the acoustic properties of a performance designed for a room larger than a courtyard. Every word landed in the assembled space with the clarity of someone who understood that the audience mattered. The courtyard went still. Deo and Son exchanged a look. The staff found places to be that were adjacent to the situation. Bartholomew's expression shifted into something measured and watchful. Eek picked up the document from the ground and looked at it. His face made the change that faces make when looking at something that is not what it claims to be, a slight narrowing rather than a widening, assessment rather than shock. He said it was not possible. She raised her voice. Amara had been standing near the entrance since the sound first reached her. She had not spoken. She had been watching with the focused attention of someone who has spent years in environments that required them to read situations quickly and accurately for their own navigation. She had been around genuinely frightened people and genuinely desperate people and people who were performing those states for an audience, and there was a quality in genuine distress that performance approximated but never fully achieved, a lack of calibration, a loss of the ability to modulate, a rawness that could not be entirely constructed. What she was watching had the opposite quality. It was too precise. Too timed. The emotion arrived at exactly the moments where emotion would be most effective and paused at exactly the moments where its pause would be most noted. She said none of this out loud. She stood and watched. When the initial scene had produced what it could produce and Bartholomew had quietly directed the household inside, Eek remained in the courtyard. Amara stayed with him. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said he had not been with this woman in the way being claimed. Amara said she knew. He asked how she knew. She said the performance was too constructed. She said people who are actually frightened and actually desperate do not arrive with documents ready. She said the calibration of the distress was wrong. He looked at her with an expression that was the look of someone encountering someone who sees what they see and puts words to it before they have found the words. She told him to stay calm. She told him to let her manage it. Inside, Vanessa had positioned herself in the sitting room and was continuing to produce symptoms of distress with the same calibrated precision. She said she was unwell. She said she needed somewhere to rest. She said she needed to rest in Eek's room specifically, which was a statement about the household rather than a medical preference. Amara appeared at the sitting room doorway and said of course she would show her somewhere comfortable. Vanessa looked at her with the evaluating attention of someone assessing what they are dealing with. Amara met the assessment with a pleasantly neutral expression and led her down the corridor. She showed her the guest room. Vanessa said she had expected something different. Amara said the guest room was very comfortable. Vanessa said she expected to be where Eek was. Amara tilted her head slightly and said very simply that she was Eek's wife and therefore that room was not available to anyone else, and that if Vanessa was uncomfortable with the arrangement she was completely free to make other arrangements. The ring on her finger caught the light from the window in a way that required no additional commentary. Something in Vanessa's carefully maintained composure shifted slightly at the edges. She said she would like something to drink. Amara said she would bring it. She left the room with the particular calm of someone who has already thought ahead. In the kitchen she prepared something cool and added a preparation she had learned from her grandmother, a combination of dried herbs that her grandmother had used for generations for people who needed sleep that was safe and reliable and complete. She had been careful. She was always careful. She brought the glass to Vanessa, who received it with the satisfaction of someone who believes they are being served their due. 15 minutes later Vanessa was deeply asleep. Amara made a phone call. She was brief and specific. She said a doctor was needed for a house visit. She said it concerned a claimed pregnancy and needed to be assessed and documented properly. She said please come as soon as possible. Eek found her in the hallway after the call. He asked what she had done. She told him. She told him all of it, including the preparation in the drink, which she said was entirely safe and which she explained the properties of clearly and without defensiveness. He was quiet for a moment. He asked whether she was always this composed under pressure. She said she had been managing difficult situations since she was 17 and that her siblings had been excellent teachers because they produced difficult situations with considerable regularity and completely without apology. He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in the way he was looking at her, something that was not about the situation they were currently managing. The doctor arrived that afternoon. The household assembled in the sitting room. Vanessa was woken and brought out, looking significantly less composed than she had on arrival. The examination was professional and brief. When the doctor turned to the room and said clearly that the woman before him showed no evidence of current or recent pregnancy, the room produced the collective sound of several forms of tension releasing simultaneously. Deo put his hand over his mouth. Sohn looked at the ceiling. Bartholomew, from his chair, said nothing but his expression said everything that needed to be said. Vanessa looked at Amara. The performance had concluded. What remained was a woman who had constructed something that had not held and who knew it. Amara looked at her with neither triumph nor anger. She looked at her with the level gaze of someone for whom the situation has simply resolved and the next practical step is what matters. She said quietly that Vanessa should go now. She said it without cruelty. Vanessa left. The gate closed. The house settled back into itself with the particular relief of a space that has expelled something incompatible. Bartholomew looked at Amara from his armchair. He said she had handled that with a clarity he had rarely seen in someone her age. She said someone had to handle it. He said yes. But he said not everyone would have handled it that way, without making it into something larger than it needed to be, without using it for anything other than resolving it. He held her gaze for a long moment. He said he was glad she was there. Eek was at the window when the room dispersed. Amara came to stand beside him. He said what she had done today was something he would not have managed as well on his own. She said she had simply observed what was happening and responded to what she saw. He said that was not as common as it sounded. She said she knew. They looked at the garden through the window for a moment without speaking. Something was in the space between them that had not been there a week ago and that neither of them was yet naming. That evening the house settled into the specific quiet of a day that has been eventful and is now resting from itself. Bartholomew had retired. Deo and Sohn were somewhere in the east wing. Uncle Pius had closed the kitchen. Amara was sitting on the steps at the edge of the garden where the paved terrace gave way to the grass and beyond it to the old trees that bordered the property, their shape visible against the evening sky. She heard Eek's footsteps before she saw him and she moved to the side of the step without turning around, making a small space that was its own kind of invitation. He sat beside her. The sky had the color that skies have in the specific hour between the end of light and the beginning of dark, not dramatic, just full. She said she had never imagined anything like this when she signed the document. She said she had been thinking about rent and school fees and the landlord's knock. He said he had not imagined any of it either. She said that was obvious. He laughed. It was a real laugh, uncalculated, and it suited his face much better than the expression he wore in his office. She noted this without saying it. She said the arrangement was almost at its end. He heard the sentence land somewhere it was not supposed to land and remain there in a way that had weight. She said it as a fact, because she was constitutionally honest, especially about things that were uncomfortable to be honest about. He looked at the trees. He said she had changed the house. He said his father's recovery had moved faster than the doctors had projected and that the doctors had noted it without being able to account for it. He said his brothers had been in the same room voluntarily 4 times this week, which was a number that had not previously been achieved in recent memory. He said Uncle Pius had told him the kitchen had been better this week than it had been in years. He looked at her. He said he knew what he had offered her at the start was a transaction and that a transaction was not what he was about to say. He said somewhere in the past week he had stopped being the person who organized this arrangement and had become someone else, someone who looked for her when she was not in the room and found the room lacking something specific when she was not in it, someone who was sitting on these steps in the dark not for any rational reason but because she was here and being where she was had become the thing he wanted. She was quiet. He said her name. She stood. He felt the cold of having said too much. Then she said she needed a moment. She walked back toward the house. He sat alone on the steps in the garden with the evening around him and the trees and the feeling of a man who has made himself fully visible to another person and is waiting to discover what that costs. Inside her room she leaned against the door and pressed both palms flat against her chest. She thought about Emeka's face on the phone the previous night, the particular pride in his voice about something he had not specified but which she had heard underneath the words. She thought about Ngozi's laugh. She thought about the small room in the apartment with the leaking ceiling that was theirs, that was home in the only real sense that home has ever meant to her. She thought about the corridor and the cart and the laugh she had not been able to suppress and the envelope the following morning and everything that had followed from a single unguarded moment in a quiet hallway. She stood with all of it for a long time. Then she wiped her face, opened the door, and went back out. He heard her coming across the terrace and turned. She crossed the garden and stood in front of him and said she had thought about what he said. He waited. She said the honest thing, because honesty was the only tool she had ever trusted in situations that actually mattered. She said she had fallen in love with him somewhere between the evening she made everyone sit down to dinner and the morning she caught him watching her from the kitchen doorway with the expression of a man who had forgotten he was being observed. She said she had not planned for it and she had tried being sensible about it and the sensible version kept failing to hold because it was not what was actually true. She said if they were going to do anything real it had to be genuinely real, not a renegotiated contract but an actual thing between two actual people with nothing held in reserve. He said that was exactly what he wanted. He stood. He reached into his jacket pocket. He went down on one knee on the grass. She said he had already given her a ring. He said he knew. He said that ring was from an arrangement and he wanted to ask her properly with both of them understanding what the asking meant. He asked her. She said yes. He stood and the ring was already on her finger and from the terrace above there came a cheer of sufficient volume to make clear that Deo and Son had been watching considerably longer than any reasonable interpretation of appropriate behavior would have permitted. Amara covered her face with both hands. Eek laughed the real laugh again and it was, she thought, the best sound the garden had heard in a very long time. Later the three of them sat together, Eek and Amara and Bartholomew in the main sitting room with the house quiet around them. Eek told his father the truth of all of it, beginning to end, no edited version. He said it had started as an arrangement and was no longer that. Bartholomew listened with the stillness of a man who has been reading situations accurately for a long time and is reading this one. When Eek finished his father was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he had known. He said he had known from the second evening when he watched the dining room come alive over a meal that he had not expected to be in, when he had watched his son across the table looking at the woman beside him with the expression of a man who is trying very hard to look like he is not looking. He said he had known from the morning he had told Amara the story about the earliest years of the company and watched her listen in the way of someone to whom the story genuinely mattered rather than someone performing interest for a reason. He said he gave his blessing without condition. He said the company would be Eek's. But more than that, he said, he was glad his son had found someone who did not need the company to make her valuable, which was precisely the right kind of person to spend a life alongside. The gate opened one more time that night. Amara had made a call while Eek was speaking with his father. Emeka arrived first, taller than she had accounted for from the week of absence which was impossible but felt entirely real. Ngozi came through behind him and made a sound when she saw Amara that contained everything, all the missing and all the relief and all the laughter she had been storing up for the week they had been apart. Samuel ran directly at Amara without strategy or preamble in the way of a person who has only one response to the presence of the person they love most. She caught him. She held all three of them. She felt the full weight of the week and what the week had been and what it had become. The Obasai family gathered around the table with Amara's siblings, and the kitchen sent out food, and Uncle Pius came and sat down without being asked, and Deo told a story that was probably not entirely accurate but was entirely entertaining, and Bartholomew at the head of the table ate more than he had eaten all week and laughed twice in a way that his doctor would have been professionally pleased to see. Ngozi, who had an extraordinary social instinct for someone of 10, had found Son within 15 minutes and was explaining to him with complete confidence several things he had been doing wrong with his life that she had identified from brief observation. He appeared to be listening with respect. Amara sat at the table and looked at the room and thought about the cart in the hallway and the mop and the corridors and the people who had walked through those corridors without turning around. She thought about the apartment and the ceiling and the landlord's knock. She thought about her parents and the 14 months between losing them and the world that had not waited for her grief before presenting its practical demands. She thought about being 19 and terrified and deciding anyway to keep moving forward because the alternative was unthinkable. She thought about the laugh. The small unguarded laugh in a quiet corridor that had started everything. The people that the world decides are background are sometimes the very people who are carrying the thing the world most needs. The woman who pushes the cart through your hallway at midnight so your floor is clean when you arrive. The girl who shows up before the city is awake to make things work the way they are supposed to work. The people who move through rooms that are not designed for them, holding everything together, quietly, without recognition. Sometimes the only thing required for all of that invisible capacity to become visible is for one person to stop and look. To actually look. To see who is there. Eek had stopped. He had looked. And what he had seen had changed his house and changed his family and changed him in ways that would continue to change him for the rest of his life, not because she was magical or exceptional in the ways that stories sometimes require their protagonists to be, but because she was honest and capable and warm and had never needed to be anything else. She had come to his building to clean it, and she had ended up restoring something much harder to clean than marble. Something that no product in her cart could have addressed. She had restored the sense that the rooms of a house are for being in rather than simply occupying, that food is better in company, that the people who live together do not have to live in parallel, that healing is faster when someone is paying attention, that love, when it is the real kind, does not negotiate itself around a person's circumstances. It starts with who the person is and builds from there. She had known how to do all of this long before she came to that building. She had been doing it for years in a 2-room apartment with a leaking ceiling for 3 people who needed her to know how. The only thing that had changed was the room she was doing it in. And the room, it turned out, had needed exactly what she brought to it. If this story reached you tonight, please share it with someone who needs to hear it right now. Like this video and subscribe to Bishop Tales for powerful emotional stories every single week. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from, and tell us this. Is there someone in your life who is doing invisible work, holding things together in ways the world has not stopped to acknowledge? Tell us about them in the comments. There are many more stories coming, and they go even deeper than this one. Thank you for watching Bishop Tales. We will see you in the next story.